The search group is pretty confident the Clotilda is on the west side of 12 Mile Island in the Delta.
In April 2018, a team of scientists was surveying the Mobile River near 12 Mile Island in Alabama when their equipment picked up something unusual. Curious, they sent an underwater drone to investigate. What appeared on the screen left everyone stunned. Lying beneath the mud was a burned wooden ship with a large compartment beneath its deck still intact. There was no mistaking it. It was the Clotilda, the last slave ship to bring captive Africans to the United States. For more than 160 years, many people had doubted the ship even existed. But this discovery proved the survivors had been telling the truth all along. This is the story of the Clotilda, and how one shipwreck uncovered one of the darkest chapters in American history. Let's dive in. The wager. The story begins more than 160 years ago, when a businessman from Mobile, Alabama, named Timothy Meher, got into an argument at a dinner table. Some of the guests were needling him about the South's dependence on slavery. While that would have been easily solved if it were 1808, this was 1859, and Congress had banned the importation of enslaved people more than 50 years earlier. Anyone caught doing it faced piracy charges, a crime that carried the death penalty. But Meher did not care. He was drunk on his own money and power at the time. He got annoyed that people thought he couldn't do it. So he made a wager. He bet that he could sail a ship to Africa, load it with captives, and bring them back to Alabama without federal officers catching him. All of this just to prove a point that he could import a boat full of slaves even in 1859. Meher already had a ship, the Clotilda, a two-masted schooner built in a Mobile shipyard back in 1855 for hauling lumber and general cargo. It was fast enough to outrun government patrol boats if it ever needed to. He had the ship, and he had the plan. Meher just needed someone willing to sail it into a felony. That person would be Captain William Foster. This wasn't some random hire. Foster came from a family of shipbuilders, and before the Clotilda ever left port, his crew quietly built a false bulkhead below deck. On paper, it was still a lumber ship. Underneath, it now had a hidden hold built for something no inspector was ever meant to see. Additionally, Foster had also been working the Gulf Coast trade routes for years. He knew these waters better than almost anyone. This was a very important detail, because a slower, less capable captain might have been caught before he ever left the country. Not Foster. He was simply too skilled, too cunning. So, on 4th March, 1860, the Clotilda left Mobile with a crew of 12 men. They were headed for the Kingdom of Dahomey, West Africa, a place most of the sailors on the ship had never even heard of. The crew members thought they were going to get lumber and other goods of the sort. But the real mission of the Clotilda, the one only Foster knew, buy human beings like cargo. That businessman was thousands of miles away, when the ship reached Africa. He was safe in his own home, living peacefully with his family, while an ocean away, a 19-year-old was about to lose everything he had ever known. The raid. While Foster's ship crossed the Atlantic, a 19-year-old named Clotilda was living an entirely different life, one that had nothing to do with any of this yet. He was training to become a soldier in his hometown near the Kingdom of Dahomey, which is now the Republic of Benin. His future was already mapped out for him: protect the town, build a family, grow old in the same place he was born. None of that happened. Soldiers serving the King of Dahomey raided his town. Clotilda and more than 100 of his neighbors were captured. It was clear that if they wanted to live, they had to follow whatever they were ordered to do. So they started marching them towards the coast. When they reached the coast, they were placed inside a holding pen where captured people were kept until a buyer showed up. Try to picture what that actually meant. It wasn't a jail cell, just a crowded enclosure on bare ground, packed with strangers who spoke half a dozen different languages. None of them knew what was coming next, and whether they would even live to see the next day. Clotilda stayed there for almost 3 weeks. He was still just a 19-year-old boy with big dreams for the future, hoping he would get out of this situation. Then the Clotilda arrived, and Foster landed at the port of Ouidah in Dahomey. He started negotiations with the kingdom's traders. These negotiations would decide who among the captured people would live and who would never even get the chance. The transaction and the journey. Foster was offered roughly 125 captives at $100 each. Meaher had given him $9,000 before the voyage began for exactly this purpose. That was a staggering sum for 1860. In today's money, it's equivalent to several $100,000. That's when a thought ran through Foster's mind. Even though this whole thing started with a wager, why was such a large amount of money spent on this journey just to import slaves from the other side of the world? That's because it was more than just to import slaves. It was a complete business model. Historians estimate the value of that human cargo, once it reached Alabama, was worth more than 20 times what Foster paid for it. You bought cheap on one side of an ocean and sold at 20 times the cost on the other, which is why Foster wanted to take as many of the captives as possible. More captives meant more people he could sell. Foster was offered 125 captives, but he couldn't take every one of them. While they were loading the captives onto the ship, Foster spotted 2 more ships on the horizon. He assumed that they might be naval patrols enforcing the very law he was breaking. Rather than risk capture, he cut the transaction short. He pushed off with 110 people, all of them crammed below deck in the compartment that was made before leaving Mobile. That compartment was 26 feet long and 7 feet high, and more than 100 people had to live in that small space for the next 45 days. Clotilda was one of them. The 15 people left standing on that beach were never recorded again in any document anyone has since found. Not their names, not what happened to them. They simply vanish from the historical record at that exact moment. A detail that tells just how disposable human lives were to this entire business. And for the 110 who did make it onto the Clotilda, the next stretch of the journey would test what a person could actually survive. These people spent 45 days in a space built to carry lumber. Not people. No windows. Barely enough headroom to sit upright. Limited food. Limited water. No sanitation at all. That was the reality below deck on the Clotilda's return voyage. Clotilda would say that while the journey was physically brutal, it was not the worst part of the entire ordeal. The worst part was the humiliation. Being stripped of privacy, of dignity, of any say over his own body, packed shoulder to shoulder with people who had just watched their own families disappear behind them on that beach. No way to know how long the ocean would last. No way to know what waited on the other side, if anything did. Clotilda had a mother, a father. He had a home. He had years of training behind him and a future he'd been building toward. None of it mattered anymore. Every one of his dreams had been shattered in an instant. 45 days later, they finally reached Mobile Bay. But the danger was over for the people running this operation, and Foster and Meaher both knew it. Burning the evidence. The Clotilda was a 2-masted schooner. These are big ships. They can go up to 100 meters in length. That created an immediate problem for Foster. A big ship, carrying more than 100 people, would be spotted and boarded by authorities. If the authorities made it inside the ship, they would find evidence of their crime. If Foster wanted to complete the smuggling operation, he had to come up with a strategy to hide the ship. That is exactly what he did. Under cover of darkness, Foster steered the ship into a hidden channel of the river, taking it away from anywhere an official might be watching. The captives were transferred onto a smaller riverboat, and then the captain of the Clotilda set his own ship on fire. He watched it burn down to the waterline, then sink into the mud near a stretch of river called 12 Mile Island. He believed the current and the silt would finish the job the fire started. That would erase the only proof of the crime forever. For decades, it seemed he was right. Although Timothy Meagher and William Foster faced legal action, prosecutors couldn't gather enough evidence to secure a conviction. Then the Civil War began the following spring, and the case was simply dropped. No one involved in organizing the Clotilda's voyage ever served any punishment for what they did to 110 people. And what happened to those 110 people now that they had been delivered to Meagher? They were divided up among Meagher, his brothers, and the associates who had helped finance the trip. Clotilda was given to Meagher's brother James, who couldn't even pronounce his name, so they called him Cudjoe Lewis instead. Cudjoe Lewis stayed enslaved on the Meagher property for 5 years, until emancipation finally reached Alabama at the close of the Civil War. The end of the war brought freedom, but that freedom came with absolutely nothing attached. The Africa town. When the war ended, Cudjoe Lewis and the other Clotilda survivors found themselves free in a country that had no plan whatsoever for what should happen to them next. No money for a return voyage to West Africa. No legal claim to any of the land they had worked without pay for 5 years. Meanwhile, Meagher, the man whose whim had brought them all here in the first place, refused any form of compensation. So Clotilda and the others did something unheard of in American history. A group of people who had all crossed the Atlantic as slaves pooled whatever small amount of money they could earn and bought land just north of Mobile. They called it Africa Town. They finally had a place of their own in this foreign land. And it didn't come because they had support from anyone. Everything the community built, they built themselves entirely, and they kept building it for generations. Africa Town was built $1 and 1 plot of land at a time. These people had already survived the worst thing that could happen to them. They refused to let that be their entire legacy. And what they built outlasted every one of the men who trafficked them. The world around them tried to forget that story had ever happened. But Cudjoe and other survivors of the Clotilda refused to forget. That refusal to forget is what kept carrying their story forward. The 110 people who had come to America as slaves kept telling the truth, even when most people assumed it was just a legend. A story kept alive. Cudjoe Lewis outlived nearly everyone who had crossed the Atlantic with him. For most of the 20th century, he was remembered as the very last living person ever taken from Africa on a slave ship. In the late 1920s, near the end of his life, Cudjoe sat on his porch and told his story to a young writer named Zora Neale Hurston. She wrote it down almost exactly the way he spoke it, word for word. She did not try smoothing it into something more conventional, something that wouldn't be so harsh. Publishers told her to rewrite his words in standard English, something that would be easier to digest for the readers. She refused. Her manuscript wouldn't reach the public for another 90 years. It was finally published in 2018 under the name Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo. By the time it reached readers, Cudjoe Lewis had been gone for more than 8 decades. But the ship that brought him to America still hadn't been found. Historians argued for years over whether the community's version of the story was even true. But the descendants never needed convincing. They had grown up hearing it directly from the people who lived it. But for more than a century, they had to endure skepticism and criticism about what they knew was the truth. They knew the Clotilda slave ship was real, but they did not have any evidence to support it. That was about to change, though it would take one stubborn journalist and a decades-long search to finally get there. The search. The search did not go smoothly for a long time. Searchers chased wreck after wreck that turned out to be something else entirely. Until January 2018, when an unusually low tide exposed part of a wooden hull in the Mobile Tensaw Delta. A local journalist named Ben Raines had spent years researching the story, and for a few days, it looked like the search might finally be over. But it was not to be. The ship's size didn't match the historical records, and it showed no evidence of fire damage. The two key features researchers were looking for. But that didn't stop Raines. 3 months later, in April 2018, he went back out with a survey team from the University of Southern Mississippi. They mapped a stretch of river nobody had studied closely before. Their equipment picked up 11 separate wrecks. 10 were clearly something else. The 11th barely registered on the sonar at all. They couldn't tell what it was. So, the team sent a drone down into the water to see for themselves. Visibility down in the water was close to zero, and they doubted they would even find anything. But all of a sudden, they saw a piece of rotted wood. What made it stand out was that it was dense and held together, like something built on purpose. When the team got a closer look at what it was, they could see hand-forged iron still driven through the wood. This is the exact kind of fastening used in schooners built along the Gulf Coast in the 1850s. But that discovery still wasn't proof on its own. It took more than a year of additional archaeological work before the Clotilda's identity was formally confirmed in May 2019. The measurements lined up exactly with Meaher's own insurance filings before the ship ever left for Africa. 86 feet long, 23 feet across the beam, built from white oak and yellow pine. What came after the confirmation is where the story gets genuinely surprising. Investigators estimated that as much as 2/3 of the ship's wooden structure had survived. This is far more than anyone expected from a vessel that had deliberately been set on fire. The false bulkhead Foster's crew built to convert a lumber schooner into a slave ship was still standing in the mud. Archaeologists could trace, board by board, the exact space where 110 people had been confined for a month and a half. Marine archaeologist James Delgado, who led the research, has called it the most intact slave ship ever found anywhere on Earth. He put it plainly. Watching the footage return in real time, seeing the physical proof of what Foster's crew had built into that hold was one of the most terrifying moments of his career. In 2021, the wreck was formally added to the National Register of Historic Places. Since then, researchers have conducted testing for organic material and possible DNA traces. They hope to use the genetic data to connect the ship directly to living descendants. In 2023, a new museum called the Africa Town Heritage House opened its doors near the community itself. They gave the descendants a permanent public space to tell this story in their own words, on their own terms, for the first time. An underwater drone just confirmed a crime that powerful men spent a century and a half betting the world would forget. But the descendants of the 110 people who suffered because of that crime have never forgotten. And they are still fighting for recognition today in a country that has never given them any. What do you think the descendants of Africa Town deserve now, after everything that's finally been proven? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next mystery we dig into. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.